In our conversation today, we're asking the question, who makes culture? When we study contextualization of the gospel, whether it's for uh, any kind of Christian ministry, church planting, disciple making, starting new types of ministries, whatever it is regarding communicating the gospel in a way that makes sense to the culture you're in, we all are always interacting with and engaging culture. Now, if God leads you into a ministry like international missions or church planting or something like that, often um, you are led by God to move to a different place than what you're used to. You are taken to a new country, a new city, a new community. And so there's a new culture to engage. There's one that you were used to, and now there's one that is your host. You are now entering into a new culture, and you are trying to figure out the best way to share the gospel within that culture while it is foreign to you. So there's a lot of understanding and studying and things that goes in to your involvement, interaction in the culture. But we have to really study who makes culture. And our discussion today is really going to get us to developing a theology of culture. And so, Bruce Ashford, in his the book he edited called Theology and Practice of Mission, actually the chapter that he wrote, he makes this statement, which I think is good to start us off. He says, mission is necessarily accomplished at the intersection of gospel, church, and culture. Gospel, what God has done on our behalf. Church, the local body of people inside of a community made up of different types of people embodying and living out that gospel, and culture, where they are. So it's the message, the people, and the environment. And so mission, gospel mission, Great Commission ministry of making disciples of all nations really happens at the intersection of these three things: gospel, church, and culture. So Bruce Ashford, in your textbook, Every Square Inch, defines culture, explains culture as anything that humans produce when they interact with each other and with God's creation. Uh, we have so many ideas of and definitions and even expressions of cultures and subcultures, whether it's ethnic based, language based, or even affinity based. We say that a culture could be something like Hispanic culture in the US, or it could be Chinese culture in New York City, which would be different from Chinese culture in Beijing, China, because they're in a different country and a different law. So there's those kind of cultures, a little bit more based on ethnicity or language or nationality. Then we also talk about cultures such as I'll use a kind of funny example of bronies. I don't Google bronies, not my thing. But I interacted, or at least saw this culture a couple years ago in Nashville, Tennessee. I was there for a week of class there at the Lifeway headquarters. So it was one of my seminar classes. And one evening, a buddy of mine from the class, we just went out and grabbed a bite to eat downtown. And we just walked by one of the big convention centers in downtown Nashville. And on the ground, there are these little pink and blue cartoon pony things. And that was like that My Little Pony thing. You see little advertising things for them, something that, like 8-year-old girls should like, right? Well, it was a brony convention, and a brony apparently is a boy who is really into My Little Pony. And so we're just kind of walking past the main steps, and there are boys of all ages, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, older teenager, to your kind of creepy looking 42-year-old guy. All right. And they were walking into this brony convention. Now, they were a culture, a subculture, whose affinity or their common interest around My Little Pony is what united them. But they had their own culture. They were wearing these little headdress horse things. They were interesting, to say the least. But they were a subculture. So they were not all of one race or one language or all from one area. They had come together based on an affinity, but they had this culture that they shared based on their desire for this cartoon. I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to pick on anyone or anything like that, because some of you watching may be bronies. I'm just saying it was an interesting subculture. And there are many other types of subcultures and things that are based on different things. But when we're looking at it from a church planting or church revitalization or just a simple gospel ministry perspective, we're looking at just what Asher says, anything that humans produce. Whether it's things we can see, whether it's a language we speak, music, all those things is what humans produce when they interact with each other and with God's creation. We can't create culture without having something to use to create it. God gave us the ability to speak and form language and to make noise from our mouths, but culture helps write music and give certain sounds and tones to what comes out of our mouth as far as language. So, anyways, culture is anything that we produce as we interact with each other, collaborative effort, and with God's creation. Ashford goes on to say a little bit later in the paragraph, we produce culture, and at the same time our cultural context shape us, which is very interesting because here we are, we as humans, we actually create the culture, we build it up and we define it and put all these elements to it, whether it's education institutions or government, language, likes, dislikes, values, worldview, all those things. We create that based on what we say and write and do and whatnot, but it also comes back on and shapes us. The creation is now shaping the creator, as in us, when we create culture. So we produce culture at the same time our cultural context shape us, affecting who we are, what we think and do, how we feel. It is the totality of our life in this world. So culture is big, and so in this class we are talking about contextualization in a broad sense, but really contextualization, when it really gets down to why we do it, it's because we have to interact with different cultures. Another explanation or definition of culture, this is from your other textbook, Facing the Change. Corey says it involves worldview, ways of thinking, language, and linguistic patterns. So these are like the elements of culture. Behavioral patterns, ways of communicating, social structures and institutions, and motivational deciding sources. Essentially, it is the social environments in which we are born, reared, and live. It is who we are as a people, as a nation, as a group, as a community. So many things go into what we say about culture. Now, in the church, or even in like a business sense, or even there at school, like at Piedmont, we talk about we have a culture of fill in the blank. So we try to have a culture of love or a culture of acceptance. In churches, we want to have a culture of discipleship and mission. We want to have a culture of whatever you want. But that building this culture of says we want this way of thinking, this environment, this common language, these things that we do and produce to all flow out of a common value or a culture that we have built. And so we use culture in many different ways, but I think Ashford and Corey kind of help us understand what it really is. As Ashford said, it's what we produce when we interact with each other and with God's creation, and Corey lists out some of those things that are involved in the concept of culture. So it really is a loaded topic. There's a lot more that can be discussed than what this one lecture can really go into. And so here's some just kind of summary points for you. What do we mean by culture? We talk about worldview. We talk about values. We talk about the customs and practices of people. If you have traveled the world and have left your hometown and been to other places, you have seen different customs done by people based on the culture of the identity of the local culture. You see different social structures and institutions that look different. The way schooling is done, the way that government is done, the way that anything is done, religion in a lot of ways. Text and products. Culture is often expressed through a text, something like a song or a story. Text could even be a movie or some other kind of artistic painting or something like that. But it could also be a product. When you think about the clothes that you're wearing, you are wearing what you're wearing largely based upon your culture. You're not wearing things that someone from another country or another culture are wearing because that is not normal for you. It's not part of your culture. I'm wearing this kind of shirt, jeans, and socks because that's kind of normal in a lot of ways for a North American culture, and many other cultures wear jeans and this kind of shirt and stuff and whatnot. But I'm not wearing a kilt. Okay, it's not part of my culture. I'm not wearing something else that would look drastically different. So that would be a product. It's something that we actually create, but it reflects the culture. And ways of communicating is often involved in culture. How we say things, what we're saying, the gestures of people's hands and things, and then also decision-making process. Is our decisions made by a group or by individuals? Are they done by casting a vote? Or are they done by a dictator? And so culture involves all these things. But I would say that these are probably the top, with worldview and values really being those kind of foundational things. How we view the world, largely based on what we believe about God, and our values. What do we value as a culture? Do we value family? Do we value generosity, or do we value individualism? So all these things are values that really undergird and really shape what we were talking about when we talk about culture. So how should Christians engage their culture? Now, this question can be debated by good, godly Christians from all kind of different spectrums and walks of life. And so this is not an answer that is a dispensational answer, a reformed answer, or some other kind of theological system answer. I think this is a very simple biblical answer. How should Christians engage their culture? Here's three possibilities. Should we be of the culture? Should we just simply say, well, we're just a simple part of the culture, just like any other religious institution? We're just a piece of it, okay? Or should we be against it? Should we say everything in culture is bad? Culture produces bad movies, bad music. It has produced, like in the U.S. and Canada and North America, which is fitting for this class, it has produced, culture has said that life does not start until a baby is independent of its mother outside of the womb, which is ludicrous and false. And so abortion is now legal because a culture did not value human life, they valued personal preference. And so Christians will say, we got to be against the culture in every single way. Or our third option, should we be in and for our culture? Because we have to be in it. We can't really escape it. If we escape this culture, go somewhere else, we're just running to another type of culture. Should we be in and for it? Now, the responses for each of these, if we are of it, then a lot of times we compromise and basically just mirror and go right into the flowing system. If we are against it, then we are essentially saying that it's not worth our effort. It's not worth our time to be involved. It is not worth saving, so to speak. But if we say that we should be in and for, which is the answer, how should we engage it? I think we should be in and for. It's what your textbook, Ashford, he makes this claim, and I think he's spot on. I think we should be in the culture. We should be involved. We should not just run from everything negative we see in culture. We should actually engage it biblically and through the gospel. But we have to be in it, so let's be in it. Let's not try to build our own compound outside of the town and say we have our own culture. That's not, you're just a cult, right? If we're in and for it, then we realize that we must be a part, we must be involved. We realize that we have to do something for its sake. We have to see it as something worth our time and effort. Ashford says, we are representatives of Christ who live our lives in the midst of and for the good of the cultural context, and whose cultural lives are characterized by obedience and witness. That is the difference. Obedience to the commands of Christ, a witness of the works of Christ. That is what distinguishes the Christians living in the midst of a particular culture or particular context. Because we are in the midst of it, but we also are seeking the good of it. We are for the community. So I'm leading a church plant in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and we are going to be called Hope Church. We are in the Simons Valley area of North Calgary, a community of about 25,000 people with no single evangelical presence in this community area. And so one of the things that we have as one of our value statements, we have 6, but here's one of them that really kind of summarizes a lot of who we are as a church. You're talking about creating a culture in a church. We want to create a culture, a church culture, with one of these foundational values, that everything we do is for the glory of Christ and the good of our city. And so that keeps us in balance, right? As we are engaging our local community, the local culture created here in Simons Valley, we're seeing that everything we do, from the preaching on Sunday morning, to music, how we do the offering and communion, to our community ministry, our summer soccer camp, our Wednesday trivia nights that we host at our local restaurant, all these type of things we are doing for 2 primary purposes. For the glory of Christ, because I think everything we do as Christians is for the glory of Christ. Paul makes that statement many times about Colossians and 1 Corinthians. Everything we do is for Christ's glory. Even the most minimal, menial tasks are done for the glory of Christ. But we should also, at the same time, be doing things for the good and the blessing of our city. Even though the city is not wanting more churches to be there, even though the majority, especially in my city, Calgary, 95% of people have no relationship with God that is meaningful, they are not in church, 95% of people really don't see Christ as needed in their life. But we are still seeking their good. Even though they are rejecting Christ, even though they are slamming Him, not all of them, but many of them, or just outright disobeying Him with their lives and rejecting Him, we are also trying to seek their good. Because the culture of our city can only be changed or affected by the multiplication and maturing of disciples made here. So let's transition now, as we're talking about who makes culture. Let's develop a theology of culture. Now, this can be a class in and of itself. There are really good books written on just this one topic. Both books from a long time ago and some current ones too. But I want us to develop a theology of culture, or a way of thinking biblically about culture. Because I think if we develop a theology of culture, we can better understand how we can both exegete it and engage the culture, which is the crux, the core of contextualization. Let's go to Genesis 1:26-28. This is the verse that is the cultural mandate from Scripture. First few verses of the Bible, God has created everything, and He gets to the end. He's on the 6th day. Genesis 1:26-28. Then God said, "Let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." So God created man in His own image. He created him in the image of God. He created male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth." Now, these verses are called the cultural mandate. Well, why? Because we were actually commanded by God, mandated by God in this passage to actually create culture. Number one, we're in God's image, so we actually can create. Now, we can't create out of nothing. We can only take things that God has given us and make things out of it. Okay? So first of all, we remain in the image, so we have the creative capacity to create. But He says He blessed and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it." In other words, create in an environment conducive for humanity. Be fruitful, and then multiply. Make more worshipers of God. Subdue it, or fill the earth, and subdue it. This subduing has this idea of not just this domineering over or very strict control over. It actually has more of the idea of stewarding it, of protecting it, taking care of it, of managing it in a right kind of way. In other words, God wants us to create the culture of humanity. Now, this was given before the fall, and so God has actually given them a very good command to follow. And at this point, Adam and Eve had not fallen into sin, so whatever they would have subdued and made from the earth would have been good. Their multiplying of themselves through procreation would have been good, right? Let's look at Genesis 2:15-18. next chapter over, still before the fall, the Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to watch over it. In other words, to work it means to create things from it, to take care of it, to work within what God had given, and to take care, to watch over it, to be its protector, to guard it against the serpent. Okay, that was Adam's command given directly by God. In verse 16, the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree of the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for on the day you eat it, you will certainly die." And the Lord says, "It's not good for man to be alone. I will make your helper corresponding or fitting to him." And so God says, "I'm going to put you in the garden to create culture, to work it, to take care of it, to create the environment for humanity to live and flourish." But God gave them parameters. Okay, He gives us parameters still today for how we create culture, even though humanity at large disobeys that and rebels. Not the church, hopefully. He said, "You are free to eat from any of the tree of the garden, but do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. From the day you eat it, you will certainly die." You will certainly ruin the culture that you have worked so hard to create in my image or out of my image. And then God does the next step. He gives them the task. He gives him the parameters, and then God gives Adam a helper, a right companion to help him do this so he's not alone. So God did everything good in order to see the success of this culture being created, this earth being taken care of. So culture making was a holy task given to humanity through Adam for the glory of God and the good of the world. So are Christians now to create culture? Yes. We'll get to that and what that looks like. But humanity at large was given this holy, God-given task to create and to make culture. So we want to look now a little bit more into the gospel narrative. How does the cultural mandate actually play out in the whole story? Because we just read the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Chapter 3 is when everything falls apart. And so let's kind of trace the idea of the cultural mandate as it flows through the rest of the gospel narrative. We see in creation what we just read. God gave humanity the capacity to create culture before sin entered. So it is part of God's good creation because it was pre-fall. Culture is not inherently evil. When we talk about, you probably heard this from some Christians or maybe some preachers or speakers or something, and it's just anytime they say the word culture, it's always R-rated movies and pornography. Right? It's hip hop and rap and rock music that have horrible lyrics about everything bad and nasty. And that's just culture. But culture is also the type of shoes that preacher was wearing when he spoke that. It's also the way he did his tie, or the way he wore his coat, or even combed his hair. Even the language he uses is part of the culture. And so it's not making much sense to just lump culture as all evil, because not all aspects of a culture are evil. Now, sometimes there are. There have been cultures in the past, and maybe some more uncivilized, we would say, cultures, where something like child sacrifice or human sacrifice was a normal part of that culture. That would be an evil aspect of culture. But in that same culture, taking care of the elderly or honoring those who are older than you is a good, positive aspect of culture. We can't just lump everything and say that culture is bad, because the capacity and the command to create culture was given before the fall. Now we step into the fall, Genesis 3, all of creation, including human cultures, which at that point was just the culture of Adam and Eve, but all of creation, including all of human cultures, remain structurally good, what they were supposed to be, how they were framed by God, the parameters that God gave for creating this culture. They were structurally good, but they were directionally corrupt. Because now the direction of culture reflects the heart of man, because man is making it. And so now it is going to be always influenced by sin, but it can also be influenced by God, because we have the Spirit living in us believers. So as we create culture, we can infuse good, but as those who do not believe are creating culture, it can become bad. So anyways, it is structurally good, but it's directionally corrupt. Then we have the rescue part of the story, where Christ comes in, where God, our hero, steps into the scene of the human story, and he saves it. He does everything for its salvation. Human culture is unable to save people from eternal death. Culture in itself, even advances in technology, cannot save people from eternal death. So God must do the work of rescuing humanity, and that's what he did through the rescue he did through his son, Jesus Christ. What culture was unable to do, what the mass collaborative effort of humanity, what it was unable to do to save humanity from sin and death, God stepped in and did that work to do that. Because he is above humanity and culture. And then restoration, the ending, or even almost the restart of existence, the restart of creation for the fall, after the fall. Restoration, God recreates human culture by restoring all of creation, even the non-human elements, to its intended state. You read the book of Revelation there toward the end, and God is actually, it's like he's creating a new culture. He is creating this culture that's all centered around the Son that is lifted up, who is on the throne being worshipped. This new culture is made up of those who have been redeemed and bought by the blood of the Lamb. They're in a new city, in a new place, doing a different new thing, because all of creation, humanity, its culture has all now been redeemed. It's been completely restored to its intended state. And so, how do we see the cultural mandate play out? Well, we see that God gave culture making as a good thing for humanity to do. We mess that up because of the fall, because we are unable to do it 100% of the time correctly or even good. We can do good, but we can also do bad. Rescue, we have to realize that we cannot create a culture that surpasses God's salvation. We cannot, in and of ourselves, create a culture that actually saves people from death. We cannot do that. We must rely on God to do that through the work of Christ. And then in restoration, we see that God has a new culture in mind. He's going to take what is now humanity and the different cultures. He's creating one unified culture, because it's going to be all the nations, tribes, languages, and tongues around the throne singing glory to God. Jesus sits on the throne. So, is culture redeemable? Can we actually redeem it? Is it the church's job to redeem culture? There are many believers and churches and leaders and theologians who will say, yes, it is the church's job to redeem culture. We're going to look a little bit more into that here in just a minute. Should we expend effort in redeeming what seems like a lost cause? We can keep doing a lot of good, but it's almost like every time the church makes one step forward in the culture, especially in a particular local culture, in no time it takes 5 steps back because there's some sinful leader or person or group that is pushing against. So is it even worth the effort? I would say that cultural redemption is a byproduct of the Great Commission, but it's not its primary objective. So we ask the question, is it the church's job to redeem culture? And that's what we want to focus on. Is it our job to actually do the work of redeeming culture? So cultural redemption is just a simple byproduct of the Great Commission. It is the result, or one of the positive aspects of the Great Commission being done in a certain place. But it's not the primary objective. If you start to preach that we must go and redeem culture, you're skipping a step. Because Jesus said, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. He did not say, go and recreate the cultures of all nations. We have to remember that. Christ did not die to redeem culture, but to redeem people. But, keep in mind, people make up culture. Whether it's a local culture based on its nationality, ethnicity, or language, or whether it's a subculture based on affinity. Christ did not die to redeem culture. He died to redeem people. It's about individuals who Christ loved enough to give his life for them, not for the culture they represent. But we cannot tear apart the fact that people make culture. We create it. We are part of it. We do it. We are formed by it in a lot of ways. So you can't separate the two, but you have to prioritize to make sure that we know that Christ did not die. Transformation of people will lead to transformation of the culture. So we can't put the proverbial cart before the horse. We cannot just say, let's just try to transform the culture, and then therefore we will help transform people. That's not going to work. The Great Commission is very clear. Make disciples of all nations. Create or form Christ followers of all the nations. And then I think we'll see the transformation of all those cultures in all of those nations. So contextualization, to kind of get back to what this class focuses on, contextualization helps us proclaim the gospel in the midst of human cultures. We have to be inside of a culture. There's no escaping it. Even so, a couple months ago, I read the book Robinson Crusoe, old classic written 300 and something years ago. It was written in the early 1700s. Old classic book. It's such a great book. My first time reading it. And even though he was shipwrecked on an island by himself, he created his own culture. He had a culture with the goats he was raising for food. He had a culture with the island, so to speak, of where he built things and what he did. He actually took things from the island and built. He created his own culture there. And then he was eventually rescued. Sorry to spoil the book if you haven't read it, but he was eventually rescued through a really neat way. But anyways, he created a culture on there. So even though he was by himself on this island in the middle of the Caribbean, he created a culture. And so we're always going to be in the midst of a human culture. Until we are in heaven one day, we're always going to be in the midst of a human culture. But contextualization, the activity of contextualization, why it's so important to study in this class, because it helps us proclaim and communicate the gospel in whatever human culture we happen to be inside of. Number two, contextualization helps us see people transformed by Christ, so we can see cultures made better through the gospel. If you want to see cultural redemption or cultural renewal or societal renewal, whatever you want to call it, we can get there. We can see some aspects and some pieces of culture change. We can't completely take a local culture, just completely redeem everything about it, because then you have to take sin out of people's hearts. And that's not going to happen until heaven. But we can see the light shine through, so to speak. We can see a few places where the gospel really has influenced in local culture in a really big way. But we have to see contextualization helps us see a culture transformed because people have been transformed by Christ. Thirdly, contextualization helps us exegete our culture so we can better engage it with the gospel. So we're going to actually spend a lot of time in the next several weeks talking about exegeting culture and engaging it, all in the realm of contextualization. Exegeting, as you studied biblical hermeneutics, exegeting is to take out of the text, right? It is, here's what the text says. Let's not impose what we think it should say or what sounds better than how it's written in our own mind. But to exegete says, let's just take out the intended meaning there. But when we exegete a culture, we are saying, let's look at the culture, the products, the worldview, the values, the language, all those things. Let's look at the culture and let it speak for itself. Okay? If we want to understand it, we gotta let it speak for itself. We can't just walk into a culture and ignore everything it has created, everything that local community has created as far as text and products and the language they use and their values and different things. We can't just ignore that. We have to exegete it and let it speak for itself. So we exegete and study our culture so that we can better engage it. And engaging has everything to do with gospel ministry. The Great Commission is a very engaging enterprise. Think about going. He says, as you're going, as you're moving about, engaging and moving, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. There's another way of engaging, right? You're dunking someone in the water to help them identify with a new Christian community. You're baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and you're teaching them to obey everything that Christ has commanded. So you are engaging at so many different levels for mission and community and formation. You're engaging it. And engaging is more than just conversation. I think gospel conversation is one of the biggest ways to engage culture. Where I am here in Calgary, in a new community that is mostly un-Christian, I'm always trying to exegete it by asking questions, but I'm engaging it by speaking a better story into people's lives. I'm asking people what's going on with their lives and digging into their beliefs, their worldview, their values, things that culture has shaped in their mind that are unbiblical or actually have pulled them away from Christ. I'm engaging them in conversation, but I'm also engaging them in service. We're just trying to take care of and bless our neighbors so that they can see the gospel as well as hear the gospel. So contextualization then helps us both exegete our culture, gives us the tools and the way to do that, so that we can better engage it with the gospel. In a couple of weeks, we're actually going to have a lecture on engaging the spheres of culture. I wanted to kind of throw this in very quickly here. These are not all the spheres, but I think these would be the main ones that your book, I have a copy here, yeah, Every Square Inch by Dr. Ashford. This book is going to go through those spheres of culture, but you're going to read it here in a few weeks. But we're talking about the spheres of where culture is made. Maybe we're talking about cultures where we interact with what God has given us, His creation, and we interact with each other. So art and media. Right? We're taking the colors and the sceneries and the abilities of what God has made, and we're creating art from it, whatever kind of art they may be. The sciences, whether it's the study of anthropology or it's a study of biology or medicine, those sciences is a sphere of culture. We have created those things in order to better understand our world. So how do we engage the sciences in medicine with a gospel framework and a gospel way to see lives changed and people redeemed? Politics in the public square. If you're living in the U.S. right now, the political scene is quite interesting. I'll just kind of leave it there. But it is a sphere of culture because depending on where you go, politics is done differently. If you find a remote tribe in the Amazon, they have a political system. They have a chief, where they have a leader, they have an elder group, and they have something that is giving governance to that particular culture. And so, how do we, as believers in the North America here in the West, how do we engage politics? How does it change how we vote or influence who we vote for? Has it changed our view of protesting? Right now, as this lecture is being recorded, and if you are an NFL fan, the big debate is, can these NFL players, or should they? Is it right? Is it un-American or even unbiblical by some standards, some people's standards, to kneel during the anthem? And so there's this big nationwide conversation about whether it's right or wrong and who is more right than the other, and is anything being done to remedy why some are kneeling during the national anthem? But that has now become a political issue. Economics and business. That is a sphere of culture because how we handle money and make money and decide how a nation should run financially, and even how businesses should be established, that is a sphere of culture. So how do we step into the business world and speak the truth of the gospel with CEOs and CFOs of top Fortune 500 companies? How do we do that? Is there a way to help Apple and Google and Microsoft and these huge mega companies? Is there actually a way to speak the gospel into those areas to influence what they are creating through their business and the products they're creating? The iPhone, which I have one here somewhere, it's right here. So my iPhone is a product of culture, but it's from a local business. It's from a business in the U.S. So how do we engage that? How do we engage scholarship and education? If you go to a secular university for any degrees, you're going to be taught differently than if you are in a Christian university. Not to say that they're going to change up how math is. 2 plus 2 is not going to equal 17. At least I hope not in a public university versus a Christian university. But there are some different expectations. There are different assumptions being made in the world of scholarship and education, where now is becoming increasingly tougher for a Christian to be in those environments without feeling ostracized or even belittled by professors who in the philosophy class say, if you believe in God, you are very ignorant. You have the IQ of this stapler I'm holding in my hand, all right? And so scholarship and education is a sphere of culture that we need gospel presence in. Technology is another sphere of culture that, right now, artificial intelligence is a really big conversation. So how can the church as a whole speak into where artificial intelligence is trying to go? Is it right to have robots who are raising kids and whatever else could happen? Which I'm trying to actually decrease my technology because it scares me a little bit. And sports and recreation, that is a sphere of culture. Right now, sports and politics have now collided there in the NFL because of this most recent kneeling during the anthem debate. But even sports and recreation, how do we spend our time and energy when we're not at work with our family or resting? All these things, though, and we're going to talk about this in a couple lectures when we dig into each of these areas and share a little more stories and things. But the question is, how do we engage these different spheres and interact with them? And because we have to be part of them, no matter where you are. Arts and media are happening around you. The sciences are being studied, and you're studying them as well. You're living them and being a part of them. Politics is always going to be happening around you. You're always going to be in some type of economy, even if it's a very, very low income tribe in some remote place in the earth. There's still some kind of economy or way of doing business and bartering. You're always going to be part of scholarship and education. You're taking this class. You're already in it now. You're using technology, whether it's a computer, a tablet device, or whether you have an electric car that drives itself. You're using technology. It's the reality. In sports recreation, you may not be an athlete, but you do something that engages your body, even if it's video games or something that's more restful sitting. It still can be a recreation. So we're always involved. We're always in the midst of all of these spheres of culture. But we need to know how to engage each of those wisely and to learn from those who are doing it well, to learn from those who are in politics, who are Christians in politics, not just playing the game to stay in and keep getting elected, but they're actually bringing out policies that reflect a biblical view of life, of money, of healthcare, of whatever it is. And so to kind of bring us back to our missional helix, which is the tool that we're using in this class, you see the CA in the top right corner. It stands for cultural analysis. Now remember, this is always important to know throughout the rest of this class what these letters stand for. TR, theological reflection. CA, cultural analysis. HV, historical perspective. SF, strategy formation, all for the purpose of spiritual formation or disciples made. And so even in our helix, we're saying, how do we ask the question, who makes culture? Well, it's a good question, because each culture you go into, you step into, whether it's a local community based upon where their street address is, or whether it's a ethnic group that is spread all across the globe but has a unique cultural identity. In contextualization, we have to know and analyze the culture we are placed in, so that we can know the best way to share the gospel. So that's why cultural analysis is one of the biggest and most essential pieces. It's not where we start. We start with theological reflection, what Scripture says. But understanding our culture is huge, because if you don't do that, you actually cannot form ministries, church plants, whatever type of gospel enterprise it is. You can't do it without understanding the culture as well. And so that wraps up our lecture on who makes culture. We talked about some definitions and understandings of culture. We asked, how should Christians engage it? Should we be just completely in it? Should we be all against it? Or should we be in and for it? I guess, no, so should we be of culture? Should we be against it? Or should we be in and for it? And then we started developing a theology of culture. We started with the cultural mandate there in Genesis 12. We looked at the cultural mandate as it expressed the whole gospel narrative of the Bible, from Genesis, Revelation. And then we started discussing how culture making is a holy, God-given enterprise, but cultural redemption is a byproduct of living out the Great Commission. And then we looked at how contextualization actually helps us interact with and engage, exegete and engage our culture. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and just know that asking these questions and starting to understand these things will help you, not just in the rest of this class, but will help you in the ministry that God has placed you in.